Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past that honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you're here. Last time, we followed the brilliant life of Cyrus the Great, from his overthrow of the Medes, the founding of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and his violent death at the hands of an unconquered queen. Today, we will see what happened to the empire just after Cyrus was laid to rest in his humble tomb and meet another brilliant king of kings, Darius I. Before we do, I have to confess something to you all. I didn't want to do this episode. To be more precise, I didn't want to give Darius a stage by himself. I thought I knew a bit about him, and for various reasons, my impressions were a bit sour. I just kind of didn't like him all that much. Maybe because I came to like Cyrus so much, what with his general benevolence, his establishment of human rights, his, core decency. Sure, his hubris, his need to keep conquering, it eventually led to his own death. But I argued that Cyrus is the greatest empire builder in history. No one wants to be the guy that follows the guy. How could anything compare? I kind of thought that Darius just really rode Cyrus's coattails. Cyrus did all the work, and Darius just benefited from having had an all-time great precede him. So when I started writing the episode about Cyrus I, I envisioned slipping in a few words about Darius as a kind of epilogue. After all, given the format of this show, it would be hard for me to not at least acknowledge that Cyrus was followed in short order by another, the Great. Then, two things happened. The first is that the second part of the Cyrus episode got long. To date, it's the longest episode yet. The second is, I realized I wasn't being fair to Darius. And trying to figure out which few short lines I would insert as an epilogue, I realized that there was a lot more to the guy than a fortuitous predecessor. The more I looked, the harder it became to keep the mention of Darius limited to a paragraph. Darius was, definitely, a distinct and significant historical figure. Sure, he benefited from a predecessor that did a lot of legwork in building an empire. But Darius made his own contributions too. Just because we are picking up immediately where the previous Great of History episode left off doesn't mean the events in this episode aren't dramatic, interesting, and controversial. So there's that. And besides, this series is about the greats of history, and Darius I is known to us as Darius the Great. The more I got to know him, the more I realized I needed to rethink my previous bias. But did Darius earn his epithet, or was he fortunate enough to be the right guy at the right time? I'm not sure yet, but let's give him a little bit of our time, and we can find out together. But I solemnly swear that even though his son, Xerxes I, is also known as Xerxes the Great, this will be our last Persian king of kings for a while. I will have to move on to the next subject, because the one that comes after this is looming over my head, and it will soon be time to dive into the story of the most famous, the Great, in all of history. All the more reason to give Darius I his due. He's about to be seriously overshadowed. In our last episode, we buried Cyrus the Great in his humble tomb in his ancestral home of Pasargadae. Before departing on his fateful final campaign, he had tasked his son, Cambyses II, with planning the next great conquest, an invasion of Egypt. Cambyses dutifully took up the call, and from his seat in Babylon, he spent considerable time planning. A campaign to conquer Egypt was no small feat. Remember, we're only 75 years or so removed from Necho II, Carchemish, the death knell of Assyria, and all the fun events described in Nebuchadnezzar's episodes. Conquering Egypt promised to be no easy task. In the prior decades, the Neo-Babylonians had tried their hand at it once or twice, and the Egyptians had fought off these invasions. Maybe they weren't an expansionist empire anymore, but they were not to be taken lightly, especially when defending their home turf. Dutiful Cambyses drew up a strategic plan, raised military units for the conquest, even planned baggage and supply train logistics. His preparations were thorough and methodical. Before leaving on what proved to be his final campaign, Cyrus did two things. The first is that he elevated Cambyses to be co-emperor and regent of the Persian Empire. While Dad was out of conquering, Cambyses would run the show back home. And as Cyrus marched off, Cambyses was to keep planning for the big campaign. When Dad got back, they would put these plans into motion and have a super fun father-son romp down to Egypt. Except Dad wouldn't be coming back. The second thing Cyrus did before hitting the road was to elevate his other son, Bardia, to a high-level satrapy. You may recall that I mentioned Bardia in the Cyrus episode as someone of great importance to the future story. Cyrus also exempted Bardia's satrapy from taxes, meaning he could keep all the revenues generated from his territory. This elevated the junior son almost to pure status to the senior one, It also meant that Bardia would gain extreme wealth, power, and prestige even above all the other satraps, giving the younger son a measure of autonomy from Big Brother in a manner not enjoyed by the other satraps. Cyrus's pre-campaign arrangements ensured that the family dynasty was set up for future success. With all Cambyses' meticulous plans for Egypt, everything was ready for Dad to put the feather in his cap when he got back from his eastern campaign. But as we saw last time, Cyrus didn't live long enough to put this plan into action. When the mighty Cyrus fell by the sword at the hands of the vengeful and unconquerable queen Tamiris, the Persian world fell into deep mourning. As per the custom, once the appropriate mourning time had passed, Cambyses took up his inheritance and assumed sole command as the new king of kings. The careful planning of Cyrus ensured a smooth transition, itself quite a feat in the ancient world. New rulers in the ancient world were especially focused on establishing their legitimacy from the outset. As we got to know the Median and the Persian world in our previous episodes, we spent some time exploring the nature of the tribal structure of these societies. Neither people had a long history under a consolidated sole rule structure. This was a new development, and there were more than 24 tribes of Persians alone, each with its own leadership structure. Consider, too, that despite having vanquished the Medes, Cyrus had likewise decreed that they would be fully equal to the Persians, maintaining a significant portion of their own traditional leadership structure. As the newly enthroned king of kings, Cambyses had a lot to prove to a lot of people. Thus, a war of conquest with Egypt wasn't just a vanity project. It was an important way for the son to show that he was a true and worthy heir to his great father. And he had been planning and planning and planning, and now it was time to put those plans into action. It didn't take Cambyses long to mobilize after his investiture as sole ruler. After all, what better way to ensure his legitimacy and to match the exploits of his late great father than to conquer the great, ancient, powerful, and rich kingdom of Egypt? In 525 BCE, he put his plan into motion, gathered up his massive forces, and began the methodical march toward Egypt, and so, he hoped, a legacy of his own. But here's where things get tricky. Remember the brother, Bardia? Roughly half the sources suggest that Cambyses was threatened by the growing wealth and power of his little brother. Encamped in his rich satrapy, exempt from taxes, every bit a member of the mighty Achaemenid family as his older brother, Bardia posed a threat to Cambyses, especially when Big Brother marched off to Egypt and left the administration of the kingdom in the hands of subordinates. While Cambyses was focused on Egypt, Bardia could cause problems, even possibly making his own claim for the throne. So let's call this version A. In this version of events, Bardia had really been Cyrus's favorite all along. He was stronger and more handsome and more charming, and it was only because Cambyses was the older brother that Cyrus had reluctantly turned the kingdom over to him. But Cambyses knew Cyrus's true feelings, and Cambyses was jealous of his little brother. In version A, to ensure that little brother couldn't cause any trouble while he was out on campaign, the jealous and pernicious Cambyses quietly had Bardia killed, but he didn't tell anyone, lest they resent Cambyses for it. In version A, Cambyses set out to conquer Egypt with his brother quietly dispatched of while everyone thinks Bardia is alive and well. Personally, I think version A is silly, and it has everything to do with Darius, whom we will meet shortly. Then there's version B. In this version, the brothers at least demonstrate to their world a mutual respect for one another, each focused on honoring the great life and career of their father and playing their role to advance the fortunes of the Achaemenids and the remarkable empire that they had built. Cambyses is king of kings, and Bardia commands his satrapy, enjoying the exalted status that came with the extra concessions that Cyrus had granted his younger son. In version B, Cambyses leaves for the campaign, and Bardia is alive and well, governing from his satrapy while Big Brother puts the long plan and much anticipated conquest into motion. And younger brother is next in line to the throne because Cambyses was, as of yet, childless. I'm going to refer to version A and B again soon, so remember, version A, Bardia is already dead due to the petty jealousy of Cambyses, but no one knows about it. Version B, Bardia is alive and well. More to come shortly. Either way, there's no debate about this. In 525 BCE, Cambyses II mobilized the massive might of the Persian military and bore down on Egypt. At this time, Egypt was ruled by the 26th dynasty under the newly installed pharaoh, Psamtik III. This was the same dynasty that tussled with Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, most notably under the surprisingly great pharaoh Necho II. The 26th dynasty had seen their fair share of invading forces and had been successfully defending invasions from eastern foes for nearly a century. Bring it on, Persia. You may remember that Cyrus was aided greatly in his first major campaign by the defection of the great Median general Harpagus. Like father, like son, I suppose, because, as Cambyses approached his first confrontation, he benefited from a similar timely defection of an important member of his adversary's inner circle. A man named Ujahorisnet, the admiral of the Egyptian navy, sailed out to confront the Persian invaders. But rather than fight for hearth and home, he shrewdly switched sides. Persia grew that much stronger, and Egypt that much weaker. The Persians then won a quick, bloody battle at Pelusium, in the northwest corner of the Sinai Peninsula. Unlike Harpagus, Ujahorisnet wasn't motivated by some deep-seated antipathy for his ruler. He understood which way the wind was blowing, and he made a calculated leap from one side to the other. In exchange, he was given a position of great importance in the Achaemenid leadership structure. The Egyptian army fled south. Bolstered by the defection of Ujahorisnet, Cambyses sailed his ships south and smashed any opposition to pieces. He had another key asset aiding his project. The supremely talented young noble Darius played a key role in the Persian command structure. This Darius was energetic, ambitious, and singularly focused on achieving victory. I know a lot of these guys use the same name over and over, but yes, this Darius is that Darius. So who was this young commander? How had he risen to a position of importance? Way back at the early phases of the first part of the Cyrus episode, I mentioned that early in the history of the Achaemenid dynasty, the patriarch, Thespes, had two sons, Cyrus I and Ariamnes. We've been following the descendants of Cyrus I as the senior branch of the family, but I did mention that we would come back to the descendants of Ariamnes eventually. Ariamnes, it would seem, was the great-grandfather of Darius, which made Darius a member of the extended Achaemenid family. This was a crucial lineage for Darius. He might have been of the lesser branch of the family tree, but at least he was on it. It marked him out as a member of the nobility, which, when combined with his raw talent, set him up for a promising career, which he had realized through his obvious military talents. His father, Hystaspes, was second cousin to and had served both as satrap and commander under Cyrus. Thus Darius was both a young commander of great talent and of impeccable pedigree. It wasn't his side of the family that had been running the show for a few generations, but it was their time to take the stage. Well, almost. Through hard work, a keen intellect, and a dash of familial nepotism, Darius had shot through the ranks to a key position in the court of his distant cousin Cambyses. By the time of the Egyptian campaign, Darius had the key position of the king's spear-bearer. The title was ceremonial, but his role was important. He was a key advisor to the King of Kings and a commander in the ranks of the Persian military juggernaut. He had an up-close and personal view of the king, of command, and how it all worked. With Darius part of his command structure, Cambyses carved through Egypt, winning a series of battles and constantly putting the pharaoh to flight. The capstone of the project was the capture of Memphis, and with it the Egyptian court. Cambyses made Memphis the seat of Persian power in the ancient Egyptian kingdom, and he reorganized the territory as a satrapy. At first, Cambyses demonstrated the typical benevolence toward a vanquished foe as that of his father. But the Greek historian Herodotus, writing about a century after the events, describes a chilling incident after the outcome of the conquest had been settled in Persia's favor. Furious over their subjugation, a group of Egyptians murdered a Persian ambassador and the entire 200-strong crew of his naval ship. In retaliation, a furious Cambyses rounded up 2,000 Egyptian nobles, including a son of the vanquished Psamtik III. He ordered them all slaughtered, while Psamtik looked on. Poor Pharaoh Psamtik III was then laden down with chains and carted off to a key Persian city in the east. Psamtik III was allowed to live, as was the custom established by Cyrus, but unlike Croesus, Nabonidus, or Astyages, he never adjusted to his circumstances, and he would eventually commit suicide while in captivity. Cambyses' long-planned invasion and conquest of Egypt was, from a Persian point of view, a complete success. He had succeeded where Nebuchadnezzar had failed. Twice! The Persian Empire, that had been forged by the iron will of his father, grew considerably in size, wealth, and prestige. Egypt, diminished though it was, still possessed an enormous amount of wealth and prestige, and these now flowed up to Cambyses. He was off to a great start, adding to the legacy of the Achaemenid rulers. The Persian conquest ended the 26th dynasty and rendered Egypt a vassal state. Excepting a brief rebellion against the Achaemenids, in which a group of locals took back control for a few decades in the 300s BCE, the country would not gain independence until 1922, almost 2,500 years later. Even for a country with a long history, that's quite a long time to be someone else's colony. For his part, Cambyses threw the military might of Persia all over the place, subduing not just Egypt, but the Nubians to the south, even the dreaded Libyan raiders to the west. His campaign stretched across years, and his conquest projected Persian power west and north across Africa. Persia moved into the region and set up shop, radiating their power out from Memphis and into the surrounding territories and kingdoms. This was less of a problem for these conquered people than it might have been in previous cycles of conquest and liberation, for, once within the Persian Empire, newly conquered people enjoyed a high degree of respect and social status. One of the hallmarks of Persian governance style was that their imperial project would be much more sustainable if all their subjects received fairness, equal status, freedom of religion, and the right to just treatment at the hands of the local administration, including from the satrap himself. Cambyses understood the wisdom of Cyrus's policy, and he enacted it. Well, after cutting down a few thousand Egyptians for their crimes against his regime. The defector, Ujahoraznet, was retained as an advisor to help the Persians understand and incorporate Egyptian customs into their local governance. Now, Cambyses isn't really the focus of this episode, so we don't need to dwell on him, but I have to say, I feel kind of bad for the guy. He is definitely the target of some vitriol in the sources. So many of the histories or chronicles we have from the ancient world come from the Greeks, and for one reason or another, the Greek historians just did not like this guy. I have a pet theory as to why, and I'll share it when we get to Alexander in the next episode, but the Greeks make Cambyses seem like an unstable drunk who defiled sacred Egyptian gods and objects and animals of religious veneration. This appears to be nonsense. Cambyses seems to have conducted himself with every bit as much cultural respect to the local people as his fair-minded father. He liked living in Egypt, and he used it as a base for his regional campaigns. He spent 3 years there. In 522 BCE, he needed to head home because there was a rebellion flaring up. It seems as though someone was trying to seize his throne for themselves. Cambyses packed up his bags, gathered up his retinue, including distant cousin Darius, and headed for home. The sources that cover the events that follow are a jumbled mess, with lots of offshoots, conflicting accounts, and uncertainties. But here we come back to our versions A and B. It's about to get weird. In version A, Bardia is secretly dead because Cambyses killed him out of jealousy, but no one knows. And in version B, Bardia is alive and well, ruling his obscenely rich satrapy. In both versions, Bardia decided he would seize the throne for himself, engineering a coup and grabbing the mantle of King of Kings. But how could he do that if, as in version A, he was already dead? In this strange depiction of events, the Bardia that tried to overthrow the empire was a pretender, one of those magi, the priests of the Zoroastrian religion, a look-alike who decided to parlay his physical resemblance to Cambyses' little brother into a bid for the throne. In this bizarre version, only Cambyses knew that the usurper was a pretender because no one knew that the real Bardia had been quietly killed years ago. This absurd version is so full of holes that it's laughable, but for reasons about to be discussed in a moment, it was soon to become the official, orthodox state version. Now, in version B, where Bardia is alive, the living prince made a power play to overthrow his brother. As an Achaemenid and the son of Cyrus, he had a strong claim to the throne, certainly stronger than his cousin Darius, who came from the junior branch of the Achaemenids. And while the older brother was off enjoying his romp in Egypt, Bardia had been planning his own campaign, one to endear himself to important members of the nobility, rise up against his brother, and seize the Persian throne for himself. Whichever version of events was the real story, Cambyses rushed back toward home, but he never made it. One day, when mounting his horse, he accidentally stabbed himself in the thigh. The wound was tended with great care by the king's physicians, but, as so often happened in the ancient world, it grew infected and he died a few weeks later. There is, of course, another version, so distraught from his brother's rebellion and so unstable from all these years of dissolute living, Cambyses committed suicide. No one seems to suspect foul play in the ancient sources, but I think we should be open to that possibility too, for reasons I'll explain in a moment. Either way, Cambyses died before he got back to Persia, and someone that was either Bardia or someone that looked like Bardia was in revolt. With the King of Kings dead, who would knock this usurper off the throne? Or, given that he was the oldest living son of Cambyses, did the fact that he started his claim as a rebellion even matter? With Cambyses dead, didn't the rebellion become kind of moot? Well, no. As it turns out, there was a group of nobles committed from preventing little brother, or the pretender, or whoever the heck this guy was, from taking the throne for himself. For a moment, versions A and B don't matter. It was into this chaos that Darius firmly steps into the fold. Calling on his Achaemenid ancestry, Darius assumed a leadership position to challenge, quote-unquote, Bardia. Darius teamed up with 6 other scions of other noble families and planned to obliterate the unworthy king. Pooling their considerable resources, the Gang of Seven had no issues brushing aside the feeble resistance, grabbing Bardia/fake Bardia, and putting him to the sword. Thanks to Cambyses' Egyptian campaign, the Persian Empire was bigger than ever, and now the throne was empty. The rightful king was dead, the pretender to the throne had been dispatched. Whether the guy they just killed was the real Bardia or some fake Bardia that almost everyone thought was the real guy didn't matter. Either way, Bardia was dead. Neither Cambyses nor Bardia had a son before their untimely deaths. The Persian throne room was a very quiet place indeed. The huge empire needed a ruler. Of course, there's still another version of events that should be considered. Cambyses died of gangrene. Bardia rightfully inherited the throne as the eldest member of the senior branch of the Achaemenids. In this version, he wasn't in revolt as much as he was trying to claim his rightful inheritance. Darius and his co-conspirators invented the whole ridiculous version A to justify their overthrow of a legitimate ruler. It's hard not to look at all these different versions without finding the grasping and ruthless ambition of Darius as a common theme in all of them. The Gang of Seven had been united in a common purpose: dispose of Bardia. This they had done with speed and efficiency. Once accomplished, the big question loomed over the compatriots: who should be king? It would be easy for this group to turn on one another, to fight it out for control. Of course, the rule of Persia was a very tempting prize, but these noblemen were comrades, brothers in arms. They had been a key part of the conquest of Egypt, and had successfully beaten back Bardia's coup, or invented a coup so they could justify one of their own taking power. They didn't want to turn on one another. Not only were they bound by affection and by common experience, but they were smart enough to understand that violence between them would only weaken all of them, no matter who emerged as an ultimate winner in the contest. But how to decide who should be King of Kings? Not wanting to spark a civil war, they struck on a novel solution. They would gather and mount their horses just before dawn. The rider of the first horse to whinny at the rising morning sun would be king, and all others would dedicate themselves to loyal service. Let the fates, or Lord Wisdom, Ahura Mazda, choose the most worthy to be king. The conspirators also agreed that regardless of who ascended to become king, the other six would unconditionally support him. But those six would all have the senior-most positions within the empire and would enjoy full access to the king at any time for any reason, the only exception being times that the king was enjoying the company of one of his wives or concubines. By leaving the decision in the hands of a supreme being, the Gang of Seven made it much easier for any of them to accept the eventual outcome. Pretty clever plan. But Darius was more clever still. Not daring to leave something so valuable to chance, he rigged the contest to his advantage. He had one of his retainers rub the, delicate parts of a mare in heat. Once everyone took to their mounts, just as the sun was coming up, the retainer subtly waved his hands under the nose of Darius's horse. Excited with lust, the horse whinnied, and just like that, Darius was King of Kings. I hope the other guy washed his hands. True to their word, the other six nobles accepted the outcome and pledged their loyal service to Darius. Just like that, what could have been a violent and chaotic civil war was steered towards a peaceful and mutually agreed upon transition of power. This remarkable and peaceful transfer of power, well, peaceful after the violent suppression of Bardia, whoever he was, it stands out as unusual. As time will tell in episodes to come, royal deaths could trigger cataclysms of violence, with contestants stopping at nothing to be the one in control. Now that Darius was on the throne, let's revisit what happened to Bardia. Was it version A, the pretender, or version B, the real son of Cyrus, who got swept aside in the tide of Darius' ambition? As I said before, version A is laughable. Too many coincidences and strange events. Besides, why would some look-alike decide to grab the throne because he looked like the king if no one even knew the king was dead? It's just too implausible. But version A did become the official story. Why would Darius want to claim that he'd knocked off a look-alike pretender? Pretty simple. The real Bardia was a more legitimate king. With Cambyses gone, no matter how he came to be on the throne, as the eldest male of the senior branch of the Achaemenids and the last living son of Cyrus the Great, Bardia was the logical and rightful successor. Darius needed to delegitimize Bardia to justify his own seizure of power. And so he told everyone that Bardia was a fake, a pretender that he'd overthrown. In the state-sanctioned version, Darius' usurpation was cast not as an act of rebellion, but of pious devotion to the truth and to the empire. This justified the coup, and so Darius' hope removed any lingering doubts about his own legitimacy. With Cambyses not around to defend himself, Darius could make this farce complete by telling everyone that Cambyses had killed Bardia long ago. This had the added benefit of knocking down not only Cambyses, but his branch of the Achaemenid family, too. I'm telling you, poor Cambyses had people tearing him down and tearing down his reputation at all turns. I personally don't think we can completely discount the idea that Darius engineered the assassination of Cambyses either, but who knows? At some point, it's a bit moot, because no matter what happened, Darius I was now in control of the biggest and most powerful empire the world had ever known. To cement his legitimacy, Darius gathered up as many of the royal women from Cyrus's line of the family and married them all at once. These included the daughters of Cyrus and the widow of the one way or another now dead Bardia. This wasn't too dissimilar from when Cyrus married his own aunt at the outset of his own rule. Darius's move was not exactly one done by convinced that he really had the right to be king. Not only were these appropriated women lending their credibility to him through this forced marriage, but none could remarry and sire someone that might have a stronger claim to the throne than Darius. It's also worth revisiting the lineage of Darius. Back in the first episode of the series, we learned that Sargon roughly translates from the Akkadian as the legitimate king, which meant that he was probably not a fully legitimate king. Darius did something similar. He didn't change his name upon becoming King of Kings, but he did take to referring to himself as Darius, an Achaemenid. That makes us wonder if he really did descend from the lesser branch of the Achaemenid family. His father seems to have been ennobled, and Darius had social rank before all these events. But it's not impossible that he invented his descent from Ariamnes as a way to tie himself to the Achaemenid family in order to make a stronger claim to the throne. If he was really an Achaemenid, would he have really needed to have said it? Who knows? But if others had some questions about how he came to the throne, they would soon understand that once seated upon it, he brought considerable talent to the equation. And, as soon as he was in charge, all hell broke loose. Shortly after ascending the throne, and perhaps fueled by all the chaos of the last few years, rebellions broke out all across the empire. One simple explanation for these rebellions was that Bardia, as a son of Cyrus, was actually quite popular. It's possible that, far from the deviant, unliked, and unloved usurper portrayed by Darius in imperial propaganda, Bardia could have been a worthy heir to Cyrus. With him gone, no matter what rationale was used to explain it, the people rose up in revolt, everywhere, all at once. With crises erupting all over the empire, the first year of Darius' reign was one of frantic scurrying about from place to place, stamping out the flames of rebellion here, crushing a pretender there. In fact, from 522 to 519 BCE, Darius had to contend with 13 major insurrections, many of them occurring simultaneously. It shouldn't be taken as an indictment of Darius that these rebellions happened. If there's been one clear pattern throughout this series, it's that newly enthroned rulers often face significant threats from enemies, both foreign and domestic. No one would mess with Cyrus. He was the one and only. But in the chaotic years following his death, why not take a shot at claiming or reclaiming power for yourself? Maybe the warriors would come out and play. It's a testament to his energy and talent that he handled so much simultaneously. These rebellions happened across the breadth of the empire. Somehow, the energetic king, determined to hold onto the throne he had worked so hard to attain, managed to crush all these rebellions one by one. He was everywhere. In this great project, he had a trusted ally, his father, Hystaspes, who had served as satrap under both Cyrus and Cambyses. The father-son duo methodically got all the empire under control. We also shouldn't overlook the support Darius received from the members of his original Gang of Seven. Having first played a key role in overthrowing quote-unquote Bardia, these noblemen, named Otanes, Interphranes, Gobirus, Hydarnes, Megabyzus, and Aspathenes, were energetic in their defense of their co-conspirators' new throne. As an editorial note, Megabyzus is one of my favorite names from antiquity. They were living up to the solemn vow of support promised through their dawnlight ritual. Normally, kings want to play down rebellions against them, but Darius took an interesting step. He carved the history of his suppression of these revolts into rock in big, giant inscriptions that everyone can see to this day. It was important for him to tell everyone that every single person that had challenged his rule had been defeated. Besides, the sheer scale of this accomplishment actually was worth bragging about. If 13 different rebellions flared up almost simultaneously and Darius could organize a response and beat them all back, then this didn't prove that he was weak or unpopular. On the contrary, by essentially winning a baker's dozens of campaigns at the same time, Darius was demonstrating the futility of rebellion. He was everywhere all at once, power and energy in equal measure. Don't even think about it. These inscriptions also mark out Darius as unique for another reason. From the very beginning, he was an inveterate communicator, or propagandist. This by itself wasn't novel. Everyone we've met in this series proclaimed their own greatness through official channels. It's part of why what we know, or think we know, about some of these people is so stiff and formal. We talk about them in ways that they talk about themselves, with grandiose puffery. Imperial proclamations were part and parcel of empirical rule. You do it. He did it. Darius just finished doing it, and he was ready to do it again. What marks Darius out as an innovator in his communications is that, for the first time, his inscriptions acknowledge challenges from within the empire itself. It wasn't all rosy all the time. So far as I can tell, no previous ruler cloaked rebellion in such stark and plain light. Previous leaders avoided any suggestion that anyone was unhappy to be under their rule. Darius frankly acknowledged that these rebellions not only happened, but that were pervasive. He took details to new levels. Darius also addressed the questionable sequence of events that led him to becoming King of Kings. He was quite careful to carve version A into stone. That wasn't the real Bardia. It was one of those magi, a pretender named Guamata. Yeah, that's it. In his quest to restore imperial authority, Darius also leaned on his co-conspirators to suppress the revolts and to bring order to the empire. In 521 BCE, one of the Gang of Seven, Intiphanes, was instrumental in toppling a usurper in Babylon who had seized the throne and styled himself Nebuchadnezzar IV. Intiphanes efficiently swept aside the pretender and restored Persian control, having done his duty and fulfilled his vow to be of service to the King of Kings, and honoring the agreement that had brought about Darius' accession. Now, Intiphanes wanted Darius to live up to his side of the bargain. One evening, while back at home, Intiphanes had some things to discuss with Darius. He went to pay a visit, recalling the pact of unrestricted access to the king to which all the Gang of Seven had agreed. As he approached Darius' quarters, 2 imperial guards stopped Intiphanes. The king was with his wife, well, one of his wives, the exception of unrestricted access to which they had all agreed before mounting their horses and waiting for the dawn. The guards barred his entrance and ignored his pleas that he and Darius had an agreement of unfettered access. Enraged, Intiphanes drew his sword and cut off the ears and noses of the guards. Then he tied them together using the bridle of his horse. When the 2 terror-stricken and mutilated guards were brought before Darius, he immediately suspected that a coup was afoot, involving not only Intiphanes, but all the other members of the Gang of Seven. Given their collective power, they could pool resources and combine to overthrow him, just as they have done to Bardia. Concerned though he was, Darius didn't immediately lash out at his retainers. Rather, he kept his cool, and he sent for them, one by one. He methodically questioned each of them about their intentions, their loyalty, and their connections to Intiphanes. After gathering up their testimony and weighing the evidence, Darius was satisfied that Intiphanes had acted impulsively and alone. There was no wide-reaching conspiracy to topple the king at work. He took no actions against the rest. But to be safe, he revoked their privileged and unconstrained access to him, reneging on the pledge that they had all sworn at the outset of their coup. This is a bit remarkable. History is littered with examples of rulers who suspect a coup and preemptively initiate a purge against all those under suspicion. Better to strike first and go a little too far than to be a bit tentative and lose your own head and throne. Far less often in history do we find examples of rulers who are gripped with worry or paranoia, but then take a deep breath and have a calm and measured approach, gathering up information, taking a more reasoned path. Darius trusted his own judgment, and he judged his allies to still be loyal. They would remain so throughout the rest of his life and career. As for Intiphanes, his fate was sealed the moment he drew his sword. Whether he was planning to cut down the king or indulging in an outburst, he had demonstrated that for all his obvious military gifts, he was prone to jealousy, pride, and violence. Mutilating the king's guards was an assault on the dignity of the king himself. The point was moot as to whether Darius felt that Intiphanes was simply acting impulsively or instead suspecting that his noble and family were plotting an assassination. Intiphanes was condemned to execution. But just in case there was a conspiracy afoot, in addition to his former ally Intiphanes, Darius ordered all of the disgraced noble's children, as well as all the rest of the males of his family, to be rounded up. He condemned them all to death, punishment for Intiphanes' violent outbursts, and to present the family's ability to avenge his execution. Intiphanes' wife, lamenting the fate of her family, stood by the palace gates and wailed loudly, morning, noon, and night, non-stop. The sounds of her laments echoed throughout the palace. Eventually, Darius tired of the noise, and he wanted it stopped. He sent a messenger to the grieving woman to convey the message that the King of Kings said she could pick one relative to spare from execution as long as she would bring her relentless wailing to an end. Perhaps through tears, she chose her brother. The messenger brought the word to Darius. He was intrigued. Why, he inquired, when given the chance to spare any one of the condemned, would she spare not her husband or one of her sons? Why her brother? The woman responded that she could always remarry and have more kids, but given that her parents had already passed on, her brother was the last living member of her immediate family. More than happy just to have the constant crying at an end, Darius was also impressed with her familial devotion. He granted clemency to her brother, and, for good measure, spared her oldest son as well. He wished her well rebuilding her family, then executed everyone else. We're going to pause the story here with Darius having ascended to the throne, fighting off rebellions, and wiping out one of the companions that had helped him come to power. It was off to a bit of a rocky start, but as time would tell, Darius would settle into his role and things would go a bit more smoothly from here on out. In time, his rule would stretch to a remarkable 36 years. But would he do enough to be considered great? As a reminder, please consider sharing the show with your network of friends and family. Your help is deeply appreciated. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join me the next time to see how the newly enthroned King Darius I overcame these initial challenges and, building on the work of his predecessors, sought to take the Persian Empire to heights previously unknown in human history.